This is the story of a humble boy who was born in poverty and worked since he was little repairing shoes, son of lower-class parents. His father worked as a weaver and his mother repaired shoes. Sometime later this boy would become one of the men richest in the world and one of the greatest leaders of the industry in the United States. His name is Andrew Carnegie, the American industrial magnate, businessman and philanthropist. He was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, a city in Scotland, in the midst of poverty in a small hut. His parents were William Carnes, and a weaver who had no hope that his son would arrive other than to follow in his footsteps. His mother, Margaret Morrison, who worked in a small grocery store and repairing shoes. The earnings of both parents only covered day-to-day expenses, but in 1836 luck had changed them a little. Carnegie's father had a good run of work as a weaver in the area. Thanks to that, the family managed to leave their humble home to move to a more decent house, but it didn't take long when the economic situation once again worsened and the parents Andrews were again short of money thanks to the fact that the little android's uncle worked for the state and later would be a politician. He was of great influence and example for young Andrew, who inspired him with a passion for reading and studying. This would change. To a large extent, his life would be very little the time that this child would spend in his native Scotland. At the time, Scotland was a country mired in poverty. Children were often employed in work at an early age in all types of activities. They were sent to working as workers in coal mines, as helpers in grocery stores and shipyards, etc. And many children often died due to health conditions at a very young age. Andrew lived in one of the most unfavorable times, the same reason why his family was in constant search to immigrate to America. Andrew's mother convinced her husband to flee poverty and settle in America. The U.S. government at that time offered health services and job opportunities to migrants who arrived in their country. Andrew's parents, they managed to get a loan, and together with some savings they raised the money to pay for their trip. So in 1848 Andrew Carnegie, just 13 years old, would arrive with his family to the city of Pittsburgh, a city known for coal mining and iron manufacturing as then. This child of limited resources with an uncertain future would become one of the richest men in all of history. Discovered the experts that this child used to become one of the most important businessmen in the United States and amass a fortune that nowadays, it would be equivalent to the sum of the fortune of the 5 richest men in the world. Applause. Andrew Carnegie embarked with his family. He would arrive at the age of 13 in America. At the time, the North American country received ships full of immigrants, most of them from Europe. At the time, he was already 13 years old. On the advice of his uncle, he aspired to a better education, but it was not possible. His family was low income. Andrew never had the opportunity to study formally, so young Andrew would work from a very young age. Now in the North American nation, upon their arrival in the United States, Sandro and his father found work in a cotton factory. It paid them very little. The money was barely enough to survive by 1950. Andrew Carnegie had had several jobs in addition to the cotton factory. He worked in another where they manufactured the threads, and now Andrew, at 15 years old, was working as a messenger in the telegraph offices. In this job, he had to learn people's faces, memorize the entire city to make deliveries. Between them was to deliver messages to the theater. He managed to doing them at night and thus staying to watch the performances of his favorite works. This young man proved to be an excellent, very responsible employee, despite his situation. His passion for knowledge and reading that his uncle instilled in him never changed. Music during his times free, Carnegie frequented a small library in the city of Pittsburgh that a local benefactor had set up for working boys like him while he worked in the telegraph office as early as 1853, and when he was 18 years old this young man delivered countless telegraph messages to many merchants and businessmen from the city of Kearney and stood out for being very polite. He kindly greeted by name the people who delivered these messages to them on one of his many trips as a messenger. The young Carnegie met Thomas Scott Music. This man was just beginning his career as a businessman, railroad with the Pennsylvania Railroad Music, and managed to have a lot of empathy with young Andrew, so he decided to support him and give him a chance by making him his personal secretary and telegrapher, increasing his salary from $15 to $35 a month. This meant the biggest economic leap for young Carnegie and Andrew. He always had great aspirations. He kept going to the library. One day he promised himself that if wealth and fortune came to him in the course of his life, he would make sure that other kids like him received the same things. Opportunities, because he began to be self-taught, and much of the education he received as a teenager was only thanks to his drive and the decision to go to the library. 6 years later he was offered a new position as superintendent of the Western Division. Andrew accepted, and in 1859 he became, at the age of 24, he became superintendent of the division and gave work to his younger brother, who was 16 years old, and now he became his personal secretary and telegraph operator. The experience in knowing how to relate cordially, dealing with business people, and the trust that he was acquiring as superintendent were essential for the businesses that Carney later had, and he saw how many of his childhood friends continued working as workers in some of the factories where the same work as in the cotton and thread factories. Years later, Thomas Scott also helped Carnegie with its first investments. He invested $600 in a successful company called Adams Express dedicated to freight transportation. He then invested in the Pennsylvania Railroad Company and managed to buy part of the company that manufactured the train cars. Carnegie and Scott continued reinvesting his money in industries related to railways, companies such as iron casting, bridges and rails, etc. This is how Nicky spent a few years here accumulating capital, because at 28 years old he was already a true businessman and had gained the respect of his former clients, to whom as a young man he brought telegraph messages. This boy had turned out to be quite a prodigy. While he was within the Pennsylvania Company, Andrew learned a lot about administration, management and cost control, and, of course, he mastered business relations. Business at that time, Mexico had gone through centuries of looting of goods such as gold by the Spanish conquest, and in the 1850s, after years of conflict now with the United States, Mexico lost more than half of its U.S. territory a few years ago. It had gone from being a small group of Englishmen settled on the coast of Miami to taking over the vast Mexican territory. Years later, the United States would have to unite both coasts by means of railroads. Carnegie's great opportunity occurred during the year 1864, where the great accumulated capital of meat that invests in the oil business and the manufacturing of iron and steel products, managing to make his fortune grow even more. This only at 29 years old. Music during the secession conflict, the demand for products from iron such as armor, cannons and frame. This is how some other industrial products made the city of Pittsburgh become a center of steel production. This war brought enormous profits to Carnegie. In mid-1865, he resigned from the position of superintendent and dedicated himself fully to the construction of bridges, replacing wooden bridges with iron bridges. Andrew Carnegie, 33 years old, already had an income of approximately $50,000 annually, the equivalent of more than $3 million today. Music built a 1-kilometer bridge over the River Mississippi to connect the city of Louisville with the Wild West. At the time, a young oil businessman, John D. Rockefeller, and another old businessman, Cornelius Vanderbilt, began negotiations to partner in the business of transporting crude oil by train, stories that you can find on our channel. Music. Carnegie knew that to achieve a bridge that was high and strong enough, she had to use a material stronger than iron, and he thought about steel. Carnegie and his projects modernized the United States using the same steel material, but now in buildings around the time. At the time, Carnegie planned to retire at the age of 35 and dedicate himself to continuing studying, but he could not do so because his industries did not allow him. By the 1880s, Carnegie was already the richest man in the United States and believed that he should use his fortune to benefit the people. He also donated $40,000 for the creation of a public library in Newfoundland, fulfilling the promise made when he was a young man. He continues to make donations to other educational institutions and hospitals. Andrew controlled the steel foundries. He had purchased the most valuable ore fields at a low cost of iron around Lake Superior. That same year, Andrew married, at age 50, a young woman 21 years his junior, Carney, and managed to make a fortune in the steel industry, controlling the largest integrated steel and iron operation for which it was known as the King of Steel. In 1888, at the age of 53, Carney and bought the competing company Homestead Steel Works, which had a huge plant along with the supply of coal and iron mines along the railway line and a fleet of Carnegie steamboats. He merged his shares and those of his associates in 1892 to create the Carnegie Steel Company. Carney worked for decades and was one of the richest men in the world. The teenager who began as a telegraph operator at the age of 18 managed to have large investments and accumulate his wealth, and through his companies he built the Pittsburgh and Carnegie Steel Company, which he sold to Lippy Morgan. Surprisingly, Carnegie was tired of his life in business. He wanted more time for his wife Louise and his daughter Margaret. The fortune that Andrew Carnegie managed to achieve would be currently the equivalent of the sum of all the money of the 5 richest men in the world. He dedicated his last years doing charity work. He put his fortune to help many people. He was a philanthropist at heart. He published books as Wealth That Spread to another called Gospel of Wealth. Finally, Andrew Carnegie died in 1919 in Lenox, Massachusetts. He was 83 years old. He's remembered as one of the 5 great pillars of North American industry between Rockefeller, Jack Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt and Henry Ford.